Hey everybody, welcome back, and today what I'm going to be covering is texel density, also known as texture density, how to measure it, why it's important, and why I think you should implement some basic guidelines before starting any project. Alright, to start with, the first thing you need to do is assign a texel ratio based on the units set up for the engine you are using. What I have right here is Unreal, which uses the metric system, so it's going to be centimeters and meters. So what I came up with was a basic set of guidelines that I think would work for a high-end PC system. What I did was I created a basic little setup here with an 8 pixel per centimeter guideline. I came up with that number from a forum thread for the new Unreal Tournament. This is sort of a more high-end setup, kind of future-proofing for PC games. Obviously this will be different depending on what platform you're designing for. You obviously would not do something like this for mobile. But point being, kind of shooting for high-end PCs right here. So the first thing I did was I came up with these guidelines and I just kind of created a quick schematic for me to go off of. So for every 512 centimeters, that will be 4,096 pixels. And I kind of just keep this on the side on my other monitor. So the thing that we're going to do next is we are going to create a set of texture guidelines, or textures for our guidelines, I should say. So when we come into Unreal, what we have is basically nothing. We just have a few baseline assets for that come with Unreal. Now I set up a couple folders over here called materials, meshes, textures. There's nothing in meshes and textures yet because I'm going to be making those in this tutorial. Materials, pretty basic. I have a master checker material and then several material instances made and named accordingly, 64, 128, 256, etc. So the first thing we're going to do is create the textures that we'll need to place on different objects. So what we're going to do is we're going to resize this because I tried this earlier and it was not an appropriate size for what we're trying to do. So I'm going to just create some guides here. It should snap to the halfway point like that. See that? Snap. Alright. Now let's just go ahead and resize this. Maybe a better way to do it, but that's just the way I'm doing it. The way I found this texture is I looked up checker material and found a 4096 by 4096 checker on Google. Now I'm just going to copy this around to fill up the rest of the area. I think that should be good. Let's make sure there's no space in between that. Alright. I think we have a pretty good checker material. Now what we're going to do is we are going to save this, and I'm going to go to my tutorials where I have it. Texel density and textures. So what I want to save this as, so I'm just going to save it as checker underscore, this is going to be 4096. I think that's what I'm going to leave it as, checker 4096. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Save that. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to collapse that by shift selecting everything and then pressing Control E. Now what we're going to do is we are going to create the 1024. What we need to do is we don't want to go to image size, because if we change the image size, let's say I want to change this to 2048 by 2048, that just shrinks it. That's not going to do anything for us, because this is essentially the density that we want to maintain of these checkers. So what we need to do is we need to shrink the canvas. So we're going to shrink the canvas size. Might even be able to, yeah, we can do percent. So 50% should come out to 2048. Yep. So we're just going to do 50%, and boom. See how the checkers remain the same size, but the canvas shrinks. And we're going to go ahead and save this as 2048. Now we're going to do the exact same thing. Canvas size, percent, 50, 50. And this will be 1024. Do it again. Now, just save. This will be 512. Image canvas size, percent. Now this will be 256. Image canvas size. %28. Percent 50. This will be 64. Alright, so now that we have our texture sizes saved out, what we're going to do is we're going to bring these into Unreal. So let's go ahead and import, and let's go to tutorials, UE4, Texel Density, Textures, and let's go ahead and import everything. So the purpose of making each of these textures is, and you'll see this in a moment, but we create materials for each of these texture sizes. Then we apply the material to the objects in our scene, and we try and match them up, and so the checkers are the same size as our reference image. This way we can maintain a texel density throughout our scene. Now there are always going to be exceptions to that. For example, a keypad is going to need a higher texel density than a prop. But the purpose of this is to essentially know the rules before you break them. It's like that old saying in art, you can't just break the rules, you have to know the rules before you can break them. It's a similar thing here, where you need to know when you want a higher or lower texel density on an object before you can actually make that change. So let's go ahead and go over to our master material. I made this earlier, so let's go ahead and delete that. And I'm going to bring in the 64, maybe to help reduce compilation time on the main material. This is the master, so let's save that. Yeah, I applied these materials before. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come back over here, and going to have to, this one should be correct. Oh, that's right. We need to change this to a parameter. That way we can change this texture in the material instances. Alright. Go into 64. 64 should be correct, so we don't need to do that. Let's go ahead and open this one. The rest of these. So this is the 4096. We need to replace the texture. 4096. Save. Just do that for each of these. $128. Alright, so now all our materials are applied. We can essentially place them anywhere we want, so like 256. Notice how the squares got a lot bigger. 512. Squares got a lot bigger. Put a 4096 on that, the squares get a lot smaller. The purpose here is to see the squares, how big they are, and match them up to our reference, which we don't yet have. What I'm going to do is, not sure what that is, close that. Okay, I have 3ds Max open. You can use any 3D modeling software of your choice. Just make sure the grid setup is set to centimeters or meters, depending on which you prefer. I'm going to go with centimeters because it's easier based on this setup. So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to create which would be best? I'm going to create a 64 by 64 pixels because that will be 8 centimeters by 8 centimeters. So I downloaded a tool called Griggs Tools for 3ds Max that are built for integration with Unreal Engine 4. Just click that. The easiest thing about this is, you can just set your grid spacing to what you want. 1 centimeter, 5, 10, or upwards of a meter. I'm going to leave it at 1 centimeter. Now what we need to do is we need to create a plane that is 8 centimeters by 8 centimeters. So each grid space measures a centimeter. So let's go ahead and grab a plane. Make sure Snaps is on by pressing S. So let's go ahead and drag this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's off the screen. That'll start down at this corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. W. Let's center this. Make sure I counted correctly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's an 8 by 8 plane. And now we can apply a 64 by 64 pixel material onto this, and it will be the correct texel density that we originally agreed on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to export this now. Export selected, desktop, backup, tutorials. Alright. Plane underscore reference underscore 64. That should be good. Triangulate, smoothing groups, that's all good. Okay. Now when we come back over, let's go ahead and oops, do not want to create a new C++ class. Go ahead and import the model that we just made. Don't worry about creating a material or bringing in textures. Just click import. It's fine. This is going to be very small. So what we're going to do is we are going to bring this in. See how small it is? It's very, very small. But it's easy because since we created this on the grid, what we can do is we can multiply this up however many times we want. So we know it's a 64 by 64 pixel square. It's 8 centimeters by 8 centimeters. Now that we have the plane here, what we need to do is we need to scale it up appropriately. This is where things might get a little confusing, but what you need to do according to this scale we have is what right here we have an 8 centimeter by 8 centimeter plane. What we need to do is we need to double it and double it 6 times. So we come over to the scale, we double it 2. That's 1 double. Now we need to do 4. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is the texel density you should be shooting for given the rules that we set up. This is with a 4096 on it. It also helps to come over to textures and prevent mipping because it just gets annoying with these. Let's go ahead and open all of these. No mip maps. No. Alright, so then now there's no mip map, so when you pull back it won't get all blurry. Alright, so now we have our reference image, or our reference plane in the engine. And now what we're going to do is we are going to reference all of our other objects in this scene to this to make sure the checkers are the same size. So over here, these checkers are way too small. That is way too dense for what we're going to be what we need for the floor to look like. So let's go and go over to materials. Let's see what works. That's pretty close. It's not quite. It looks a bit small. That looks quite a bit too big. So that looks quite a bit closer, so we might go with that one. Another option we have is if it's about 50-50, where you don't want to do a 1024 and you don't want to do a 512, you have the option of creating a 1024 by 512 texture. And the way you do that is when you do your bake, it'll come out as 1024 by 1024. And in Photoshop or your image editing software of choice, you will create a new canvas of 1024 by 512 or vice versa, it doesn't matter. And you will take that texture, drag it over, and bring it into this, and then scale it down to fit the corners. And what Unreal will do is when you import that, it will automatically square the texture. So it's in effect a half resolution. So it's like around 720 or so pixels by 720 or so pixels. So that's a way to get in between this and this. But ultimately, I kind of feel like that's close enough. Because this is not an exact science. We're just trying to make sure that it looks pretty close, and it doesn't look like this, where this texture is way smaller than this. This has way less texel density than this does. That becomes a problem because then consistency becomes an issue across assets. So let's go ahead and see what will look good on this. So there's already a 1024 on there, so that's clearly not going to work. So let's bump it up to 2048. It's closer. And that looks pretty spot on. Obviously, it's not 100% exact, but it's pretty close. Now, for a chair, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a 4096 by 4096 texture. That is why you will have to take use of tileable textures. So, the idea that you can use a tileable texture on this, what you have to do is, instead of using your baseline, like say leather texture, you put in a checker texture instead. Then you add a texture coordinate node, and you tile it up or tile it down to what fits the scene the best. Then you replace the checker texture with your leather texture or with your metal texture. And then you'll have equal texel density throughout. Now let's do the table. Let's try 4096. And see, again, that looks pretty close. Maybe 2048? No, that's too big. 4096 is pretty close. If it'll apply it. Pretty close, might be a bit small, so yeah, it's close enough. Then let's go ahead and do this lamp thing. Now this is way too small, so let's go ahead and see what 1024 looks like. .1024 looks pretty good. It might be a tad bit small. Yeah, 1024 looks best. So now when we pull back, it looks to be pretty even. It has pretty level texel density throughout. And then if I were to just go in and replace these checkers with proper textures, then we would have an appropriate texel density throughout this scene. And then we'll have consistent texture resolution throughout, which is what we're going for. Now, before I go, I'm going to show you a couple quick examples of what happens when you don't have these guidelines in place. The best example I found was in a game called World of Tanks. Now when we look down here, this texture looks fairly normal. It's a normal brick texture, but then we look over here in this rubble pile, it looks incredibly dense. It looks like the texture resolution is way too high. It looks way too detailed in comparison to this ground. Then we come up here and this building is very low resolution. Very low resolution. And ultimately all this does is it pulls us out of the gaming experience. So keep the textures in your scene at a texel density that is appropriate for your working platform, and this will not happen. Here is another example. It's much less drastic, but it's still very noticeable. Notice how the ground is very detailed. Very detailed. We come over here and it is very low resolution on here. This brick wall here is very low resolution. Then we come over here to the ceiling, or the roof, and it looks very, very high resolution in comparison even to the ground. And so now this has a very bad consistency issue, and it's actually pretty jarring. So that is my rant or tutorial on Texel Density. I hope you guys found it useful, and I will see you guys in the next